Good morning. I hope everybody had fun out I'd like to introduce the moderator for this morning's branding and licensing panel, which is one of those topics that creators often overlook, and this is a pretty stacked set we've got up here. Scott Austin is the COO of ALG Brands, and he's going to take it from here and introduce the rest of the panelists.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll start with at the end here, Fred Shahadi. Want to give us a little background on your history and the wonderful world of entertainment?
Okay. Hi everybody, I'm Freddie. I am a composer, producer. Pretty much my career started in New York, and now I'm in Vermont and New York, and just some of the highlights. I did the Today Show themes, wrote and produced the Today Show themes from '97 to 2007, and started my TV composing in the '80s with, some of you might not remember, Search for Tomorrow, some of you might.
I remember. To age myself, I remember.
Any millennials? No. And then I started working in songwriting and production and just performing, doing a New York, very typical New York kind of, multifaceted job. And so worked in the Brill Building, did a lot of work in the studio. And I still, and now I'm working on records and performing and managing some of my music catalog. And that's the short overview.
Next to Fred is Rose Ganguza, producer extraordinaire. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Rose Productions.
Yeah, Rose Pictures. We're doing multiple film and television projects, but I have to say that a lot of those films, what inspired me first was the music. I always think of soundtracks. It kind of drives me crazy because a lot of young filmmakers, they go, I think I'm not going to do a soundtrack, and then all of a sudden you feel like you're missing a big piece of the puzzle. But music does drive story, and I really do believe that music is character in a story, and you could take a license like any of the people that Scott and Ashley represent, and off of that create story like we do about any biographical information or whatever. Music has its own biography. Most recently I just completed filming on The Chaperone, which takes place in 1922 in New York City. And so before I started, and it was written by Julian Fellows of Downton Abbey fame, and the first thing I did was just sort of like immerse myself into the music. And 1940s, now we're working on a 50s thing, so yeah, it's amazing.
Next to Rose, Ashley Austin, CEO of ALG Brands.
Hi, I'm Ashley. At ALG, we specialize in brand management for deceased icons, living legends, and entertainment properties. And on the music front, especially for an artist's estate, long after they're gone, what lives on is the music. And how do we promote a legacy for someone who's no longer here? Music, again, is that driving force, and we work to create projects around that music to remind people of just why this artist was so important. Artists like Dean Martin and John Coltrane, for example. My background, I worked in artist management for a number of years and sort of ended up in the estate management world, working with the Doors and Jim Morrison's estate, Janis Joplin, Rick James, and we consulted for Michael Jackson. So at a young age, I was thrown into kind of working with these incredible icons and discovering the longevity of music and how important it is. So that's really the driving force behind ALG, and we opened it up to working with living icons like Iggy Pop and Foreigner, to help them establish sort of tertiary offshoots of their own brand, XYZ Artist Inc., basically, and how to get the ball rolling so that there are projects in development, God forbid, something happens, which it's the inevitability of life.
So I think what we'll do is break the conversation into two parts. I know the title of the panel has changed a little bit. We're going to talk about music licensing. Obviously, that was the primary topic, but we also want to talk about branding, inclusion of brands into the work that you guys do and how that can help offset budgets. But let's start with music licensing, if that makes sense. Rose, we were having a nice sidebar before the panel started, talking about the importance of that music and it being the thread of certain pictures.
Two stories of my experience come to mind immediately on how important music is and how you license music. A number of years ago, Liza Minnelli asked me to do her biography for A&E when Biography on A&E was the #1 show, and A&E for Liza decided to do 2 hours instead of 1, and I thought, oh my God, how am I going to tell the story of Liza without the music? And the music was Cantor and Ebb, which of course is not cheap, as you know. And so Fred Ebb was dying at the time, and I went to his apartment in Central Park West, and I pleaded with him to give me a free license on the music so that we could do. And he said, of course, for Liza, we will do this. And, you know, and then the biography turned into this absolutely marvelous thing because we had the music. But again, I started with the music. Another interesting story was another film I worked on many, many years ago, where the music existed even before the story did, was when Cameron Crowe was working on a project which was the untitled Cameron Crowe project, and he was married to one of the two women who formed Heart, and early on in his career they had written this whole score, and he built the story about his life when he was 14 years old, going across the country with the Eagles and writing this article for Rolling Stone. But it was, the whole story was built around the music, and of course it became the movie Almost Famous, which is probably one of the best Cameron Crowe movies in existence. So recently when I was doing The Chaperone, before I even started the movie, I found a man named Vince Giordano, who twice a week in New York in a place called the Cafe Iguana has a full 1920s orchestra that only plays 1920s music. And I sat with him and talked to him, and he had done all 5 seasons of Boardwalk Empire. He had done Cafe Society for Woody Allen, Aviator for Marty Scorsese, and all this wonderful stuff. And I just sort of pleaded with him, you know, to come on board because we wanted to make, it was supposed to be 1922, and we wanted to make this music really special. And what has happened since then, music licensing is expensive. So since then, we were approached by Universal Music out of London to say, okay, we get what you're doing. We had done one recording with Lillis White, who, if you don't know, is one of the premier singers on Broadway who did Dreamgirls, and we recorded I'm Just Wild About Harry, which is a standard American songbook thing. And based off of that and showing it to me, they got it. And now we're gonna have Lady Gaga and, you know, all these other people doing these standards to create a real soundtrack. And because PBS is our partner, they're one of the only groups around that still sells physical CDs off of pbs.org. And so I convinced them not just to do a streaming deal, the standard Spotify and everything else, but to actually create CDs. And that's what we're doing. And all of that was because of the music. And a lot of times, as these guys know, because they're the experts, the music might earn you more money as a producer than the actual film does, if the soundtrack is good enough.
That's right. Fred, do you want to speak to some of your experiences in the sync world? And I know you've represented artists that have had music featured. You obviously have a catalog yourself. You want to talk about that process from a creator perspective?
Yeah, first of all, just so it's great to hear how, from your point of view, how music can drive a project.
Yeah.
You know, as a musician, I always felt that way. That was my, you know, main thought. But in the real world, that's not the way it always works. It depends on the project. I've worked on a lot of projects where it was the third thought, fourth thought. And And so the idea that in certain situations in your project, you know, it's great that the music can drive like that. Let me give you one example. The branding idea. When I worked on the Today Show, the most notable theme we wrote was a song called "America's First Family," and that was the branding theme for several years with Matt Lauer and Katie Couric. And you know, Frank Radis was the vice president of advertising at NBC at that time, and he came up with that idea. We wrote that theme to that idea, and we wrote a good song that worked. This is a different kind of medium. This is a promotional song and video for the Today Show that runs at the end of the show. It's a different kind of aesthetic than you guys are talking about. In terms of licensing, we did some music for Sex and the City, A&E. We did a lot of shows, and we would have relationships with the music producers. And we would get, you know, in terms of fees, we would get, you know, we'd write original music for them, and we would get decent fees for them, for the pieces.
But then you keep long-term fees.
And that we would be able to maintain publishing interests, and or set up publishing companies with producers who are working with the shows. It's about having relationships with music supervisors and people in those positions, and developing a relationship, and then setting up a publishing arm so that you can set up a stage for more collaborations. And that happened with the Sex and the City folks. I can say that what I would love to hear are some of the numbers that you like to, I want to hear what kind of numbers people like to throw around. When you're dealing with the Great American Songbook and you're dealing with classic songs,
Those are all estates.
they are all estates. And by the way, those are, and they know those estates very well in BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC. Because that's some people say that's the country club book of songs. And what the fight has been in those performing rights organizations has been, how are you divvying up those monies? Is it a fair playing field? Are we, you know, are the monies going to the new composers, the new songs? Are they, you know, are monies, you know, people have seen great residuals, and the equation has been changing just like everything else for years on those old standard songs. I'll give you a quick example of how we figured out how to get, we didn't figure out how to get paid. It's a funny story for the Today Show work. We got the show, we were young, and we met this guy, Barry Mazarski. And we went to Barry's office. I had two partners, and he looked at us for a minute and said, he realized pretty quickly that we didn't know what we had. The quote was, "You guys don't know what you have, do you?" And we didn't. We were like, well, you know. He goes, so we talked about how you can make a deal with NBC and BMI, CSAC, or ASCAP. He set up meetings at all three of those performing rights organizations. And we ended up going with BMI, and they offered us twice as much money as ASCAP and CSAC, which blew us away. But when we went in there, instead of saying, there's 220 affiliates across the country, we need to track every song, every play, for every show, Barry said, that's ridiculous. First of all due respect, interns are in charge of keeping those notes and watching the TV. The mechanisms by which they use to track music now are probably changing with watermarkings and all this other stuff. But back then, and I say back then like 10 years ago, it was different. People would literally watch TV all day and take notes. Yeah. Now, those note takers were responsible for thousands and thousands of dollars. So Barry said, here's a pie, here's the Today Show, they give you, and NBC will pay at BMI maybe $30 million a year for the rights to the music of the composers who are signatory to that performing right organization. And he goes, we don't want to deal with that tracking. We'll never figure it out. So let's figure out a number for this piece of pie. And that's how we made the deal. Just an interesting way of how we were able to monetize our work. You know, that's a little different. It's a little off the beaten track. But for today, and if you're doing a show or a web series or something like that, we were talking yesterday. You can find boutique libraries and composers who have catalogs and really get great service out of a composer. Really get lock up and have a relationship and have the aesthetic and be on the same page and know what you're doing and get music that is really great, you know, and I know that might be something where I don't know what's driving what in a situation like that. It might be a little of this and a little of that. Sometimes it's one drives the other and then you make a tweak and the other one drives the other and this and that. But I love the idea of the music really driving a project.
Yeah.
So I hope that made sense.
And I think that's more, when you guys set up your licensing deals on these, do you also have all the rights to the music of all of these artists to license?
It depends. Well, every situation is different, and just speaking from a management perspective, we have to do two things. The first is to protect the legacy of our artist, and the second is to promote it. So it's a bit of a catch-22 when an opportunity comes in, specifically for advertising. I think that's when there's a lot of the back and forth of, does this work for the artist brand? Mm-hmm. Is this on point, and is the money right? Because, thinking about an artist estate, their royalties are not what they used to be, and the artist isn't here to be touring, and oftentimes the family is living off of the royalties.
Why is that, Ashley?
That are incoming streaming.
Explain why that is, because of the
Technology.
So the more diffusion there is, the lower the artist's take is? Is that what it is? Or because of the numbers?
I promised myself I wouldn't chime in because we're coming from the same perspective, but
no, I'm really curious. I'm sure everybody else is.
I have a long background in the music business. It's really where I started. So I worked for Madonna's label. I worked for Capitol Records and Warner Brothers Records. So basically over the past 15, 17 years, and Fred knows this all too well as a creator, there's been a move obviously away from physical records, physical products, CDs, to digital, to downloads, and now streaming. And streaming far outweighs digital downloads in terms of revenue at this point. Tipping point happened about 18 months ago. So the problem, to your question, is that each stream generates a very, very small royalty. So when you're dealing with an artist who is not active in pop culture, because they're not here anymore to be able to do that, there aren't as many people seeking out music from those icons of older eras.
Streaming is also subscription based, by the way. They're synonymous.
There's free services, but yeah, it's heavily subscription based. Right. Ashley and I run this business together, and up until a few months ago, we actually had a joint venture deal with Sony Music Entertainment. We were, as part of that, brought into a lot of the conversations and a lot of the meetings with the label folks, so we've seen a lot of the insider information, if you will, that I will never disclose, of course. But generally, if you read Billboard, if you read any of the music trades, there's talk about this move to streaming and how hard it is for pre-2000 era artists to really survive on the royalties the way that they used to.
And when you license, Scott, how long is the license for, and is it worldwide always, or is
it completely depends. We're actually right after this ends, I have to jump on the phone and try to beat somebody up to improve some deal points for a spot for an artist estate that we represent for a major brand. So it would be a national campaign that would run from early November till the end of the year. So just to give you one example, that's something that I'm working on literally as we speak. But there can be syncs that are for a year. They can be internet only. They can be a certain territory. So we're not really, from our perspective, we're working with the labels and the publishers much the way that you do on your projects. But because a lot of times we represent the estate,
the physical human being,
a human being that is either hopefully still here, and if they're not, that's what we've been entrusted to do, is to maintain that legacy. So if we see a spot request come through and it is not good for the artist's legacy, we will decline that spot. Fortunately, the no's are few and far between. Very rarely do we get approached with something that's totally not appropriate. It does happen, and you have to be able to say no. And the families, because they're depending on, a lot of the times, these royalties, it's a conversation. Generally, the larger the check, the more willing someone is to be swayed. But if it's absolutely not in the best interest of the artist or client, we will never recommend, regardless of the size
I think the
of the
most
check.
obvious example that everybody could relate to would probably be the Elvis Presley estate. And anybody who recently saw Blade Runner 2049, that whole segment at the end of the film where this hologram of both Marilyn Monroe and Elvis appears with the thing. So that's an extension of what these guys do. And those are the kind of
Those are
things you
both-
have to deal with.
Both clients of the same company.
Exactly, yeah.
Authentic brands.
Yes, they are. So do you guys do licensing show also?
Let's maybe transition into that. Actually, do you want to speak to kind of the name and likeness and to Rose's
Yeah.
example is a great example, the hologram, and how someone, a young content creator, would actually approach that and
what
getting
do you
those
do?
rights.
Where does it start?
Yeah, I mean, look, representation for these icons, every client is different, every situation is different, every family is different. So it's really going to depend. What I don't want to do is put out a negative sort of shadow on it where it's like, no, you're not, there's no way you're going to get approval on that. I think it's always worth asking the question. But, you know, again, if there's music that is iconic or there's a name and likeness of something that's iconic, you need to just think about that in your budget as a content creator from the get-go. Otherwise, you could be very disappointed. Considering the fact that, you know, this is a business. This is, you know, these artists have corporations where the money flows through and they run this as it is a business, this licensing. So just, you know, keeping in mind the rates of what it could cost, I think is incredibly important. The position we take is that we proactively go out and source new opportunities with the family's approval or whoever is in charge. And we say, look, we have ideas for this, and this in all of these categories. What are our hard lines? What are the no's? Is it alcohol? Is it cigarettes or e-cigarettes? Is it sweets because someone was a diabetic that, you know, someone didn't really know about? So, you know, we operate within these boundaries and go out and source opportunity. And for name and likeness, I think a really great example of that includes music as well as Iggy Pop. Iggy lives in board shorts if he's wearing clothing at all. And he lives in Miami and he looks like a surfer when he's not on tour. So I called up my friends at Billabong and I said, hey, you know, I would love for Iggy to be in your ad campaign. You've done a lot of music related stuff. What do you think about this? Oh my God, Iggy Pop. So they said, they came back to me and said, okay, cool. The ad campaign is no worries, but we'd love to do a collaboration. Iggy's rights, his merchandise rights are not with us. They're with our friends at Sony. So we brought them in and said, this is the idea, the collaboration, can we do this? And they're like, absolutely. They did that deal, done and done. Then there's also an appearance fee.
Right.
So Iggy will be appearing at Pipe Masters in Oahu at the Billabong House, which is the biggest surf competition in the world, with all of these surfers and is compensated for appearing there.
Yeah, of course.
Additionally, within the commercial, there's talks about having the music. Obviously, if you're having Iggy's likeness, you want those songs. So they're in discussions with Sony Music again, it was the Stooges records, about getting that in there. So I think that's a great way of explaining just how ALG with our name and likeness rights can also work with our additional partners.
So let's say as a
at bringing projects
filmmaker, I come to you and I say, I'd love to do a biopic about Iggy Pop. Mm-hmm. So you would be the main conduit for all those different levels of negotiation.
Essentially.
Yeah, that's great.
I mean,
Every situation is different. So some situations we would be the sole kind of the liaison for the project. Other situations we divvy up the responsibility, and we actually are in talks with a filmmaker now about a documentary for one of our clients. Mm-hmm. They are proactively asking us to have a very heavy role in helping, because they don't really understand licensing. It is a very convoluted, complicated thing if you've never done it before. So, you know, a lot of people are scared. They're scared to call Universal Records and try to make a deal.
No, it's
we
intimidating.
deal with these people every day, all day, on all sides, from film companies to music companies to merchandise companies. I know we kind of want to have a little bit of a dialogue with anyone in the audience that has questions, so I'm going to speed us along a little bit. But I'd like to maybe wrap up this topic by actually talking about that, understanding how to license things. Rose, and please, anyone chime in.
The one thing I have to tell you all as filmmakers and television content providers is that when a line producer gives you a budget, a lot of time as producers we don't, examine the minutia of it all, but you will always see that the music part of it and the licensing part of it, if you really analyze it, is undervalued. And then you get to the end of the process in post, when you really have to deal with these issues, and all of a sudden somebody says, oh fuck, we don't have enough money for that. Oh, what are we gonna do now?
Preaching to the choir.
Oh my God, oh, what are we gonna do? We only have $30,000 for music. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And then you have to start becoming, and what you do then is you wind up selling your soul. There are a number of companies in the business who outright buy soundtracks ahead of time, which then gives you the money to actually create the soundtrack, but then you get no benefit off of your soundtrack if you do those deals. And you know those companies. What's the one, Cutting Room? And
I never say anything negative about my friends.
No, I know. But these guys, this is their business. God bless them. But, as producers, you are denying yourself a possible asset. I always tell this story about one of my favorite all-time movies was Dirty Dancing. Dirty Dance started with one woman who was a friend of mine who had, when she was a kid, she went to the Catskills with her parents, and she had this thing. When she went into Vestron in those days, she put on the table, the first thing she did was, this is what I want to do. And she had a little cassette. We didn't have CDs in those days. She put a cassette on the table and it played all the music that she remembered from her time in the Catskills. And that's what sold the movie. Well, anyway, it was a film fund called the Great American Film Fund, which did 5 movies. Nobody remembers the other 4. But Dirty Dancing, which did really well as a film, the soundtrack outsold the numbers on the film. Until today, the soundtrack is still the earner, right?
Right.
So,
I have a story I'd like to quickly share. This is a real licensing story. And just to that idea, I think it's great that, I think the idea of making a team and getting, sharing and publishing, like building a team around a project, as a content provider, as a musician and a producer, you can all do that together. And if you get the right project for the right things, you can all share in those back-end royalties or whatever kind of equity it could spill off. I mean, you can write something that can go viral today, and then you can include yourself in those residuals. Quick story, Peter Fish wrote I guess things happen in 10 years. He did the Today Show 10 years before we did. He took the song, What a Difference a Day Makes, and sold it to NBC after changing it to What a Difference Today Makes.
Today Makes, yeah.
And I think his paycheck was about $100 grand a year for that. It's a great licensing story. We bucked him off the horse, or we got somehow moved in by the powers that be, I'll say, because we got bucked off the horse. But we got the gig from a director. This never happens. The guy who was shooting the film for the theme called my partner and said, "I'm doing this film for the closing of the Today Show, and I hate this song. I hate this song. What a Difference Today Makes. It sucks. Get me a good song." He's just like a work for hire guy, hired by NBC to do this. But so through this guy's phone call, we created a song, and he said, make it something like Hey 19, like Steely Dan. So maybe at some point you'll hear this tune, but we really nailed it. And we wrote this song and gave it to this director, and it found its way to the NBC executives, and they loved it, and that was it. 2 weeks later, we had the gig. So, you know, that happened. So weird things continue to happen. That was definitely a weird thing. And Peter Fish, I hope he's doing great, and I don't think there's any bad blood between us. So.
Well, it sounds like you both made money, and you both had a good run.
We both had a good run, we both made money, but that's a real bona fide licensing.
Great.
Truly, I wish I knew guys like you way back when. I do. No, I really do.
I'd love to open it up for questions, and please don't be shy. We have 10 or 15 minutes, so ask away. Yep.
So this is probably a really weird question. So I'm a filmmaker, and I want to speak at universities and conferences about my films, which are narrated by music that I own. But let's say I'm getting paid to do it, and I want to just as a talking point show the people the music that I don't have the rights to that inspired, just as a conversation piece. Am I not allowed to do that? You know, if I'm getting paid to
Oh, she does something live. Can she do that? Can she just play music as a reference? Yeah.
If it's not for commercial distribution, you're probably okay. Of course, every label will hate that I'm saying that, because they're going to say, no, it doesn't matter. Even if it's just for internal use, you should license it properly. I think if it's just for demonstration, then you're probably okay. I wouldn't show it in a very large venue. How about that? Know all the people in the room.
Also,
Or tape it.
I just
or
want
tape it and
to
sell it.
add something too that I forgot to say, and these guys will probably tell you the same thing. If you want to use a piece of music say I want to use a Beatles song in a film, if I use the original song, that's going to cost me one thing. If you do a cover of that song in studio, it costs you something less. I mean, you're still, significantly less.
And you know, if all the big wigs are starting to go after you for something like that, that's not necessarily bad news. It might mean you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add in a little bit. If you were talking in an educational scene, and not a great big auditorium, but if you're in a university, there is a fair educational fair use umbrella. And if they call you on it, you have to stop immediately. But if you're really, and also keep it very short. You know, the length of the piece. I used to do this a lot. And it mattered to have very short pieces, but if it's educational, you're not making a recording of it and distributing it, that you're safe.
That's right.
You're still not safe. I mean, that still doesn't mean people won't collect.
It's never really safe. Just kind of do, and then if there's an issue.
Just to add, there are some good, there's good information on where fair use. There's a formula to how much you're compensated, how much you use, so you can check that out. So they're also actually the same.
I think the simplest way to think about it, at least just from our world, is if you're making money, any amount of money off of something, then you need to properly license, whether it's footage or music or name and likeness rights. But that falls into another gray area, which we won't digress to today. We don't have time.
Yeah, so on this project, I just finished working on, we had a couple filler songs that we were editing just to kind of hold the place. We were considering seeking out the rights to those. And I really, back to your comment about being intimidated by going to Universal, I kind of had that experience a little bit, and did a lot of research on the web, trying to find out the best avenues to go for this, and found this service that will kind of be your middleman. Mm-hmm. Do you guys think that those are a waste of time? Do you guys think that those are useful, or should I just have?
Depends on
is it silly that I was nervous about?
No, I mean, I think.
Just go repair it, just on Universal.
Yeah, I think they.
Not to say that it was Universal, but somebody like that. Sorry.
Was a universal I think look, it's all about relationships in the business, and it can be, just from our being on the inside and seeing how, the label system works, it can be very complicated and feel like a bit of a black hole. So if there's someone that you trust that has these relationships that can operate as a middleman and their fee is reasonable, I don't know what that is, but if you feel like they can get you to where you need to be, having direct access is incredibly helpful. Otherwise, you have to go through the online form, filling out this, and it goes into the black hole, and you don't have a contact person.
Yeah.
And I think it's really effective to have that. So I would say if you don't have those relationships personally, try to find someone who does, whether it's a music supervisor or someone at a company like that.
I mean, I'm in the independent world, so our bottom line is always primary to us in terms of how much money we're spending, even if it's an extra $100. So in my experience, it's always been make the cold call first. Call a company, get the headquarters number and everything, and say, who takes care of this? Inevitably, you're going to get to a real person, or you're going to. And in my experience, people have always called me back. It's the only thing you can do. I mean, I've dealt with these issues of doing documentaries where I've been stalwart about pieces of music that I knew were expensive, and then just pleaded poverty to people. I do that all the time. I go, and what's the worst that people can say to you? No. I mean, and I did that with 2 pieces of music in a documentary I did. And one was Everybody's Talking from Midnight Cowboy and Moon River from Breakfast at Tiffany's. And in both cases, I got the music internationally for much less than I was first told, because I just pleaded to the prestige of the project and who was involved and stuff like that. So you just never know. I mean, ask first.
Yeah.
Definitely having the relationships, I'm speaking more than I was supposed to, but having direct conduits to the decision makers will ultimately help you immensely if you plan on doing this for a career. You're not going to want to use a middleman service 5 years from now or 6 months from now maybe. These are good people. There are, like any business, like any environment, there are people who are very easy to get along with and talk to, and there are other people who make it a little more difficult, but at the end of the day, you're doing them a service because you're bringing them money. So if you don't understand how to negotiate those rights, you should definitely find a friend or talk to someone who's done it before, to Rose's point. But I definitely would encourage you to contact these people directly, because it moves the needle, it gets things done, and you're probably going to want to go back and work with them in the future.
Thank you.
And to add to that, we're having my sister and I are a company called Rapid Films, and we have a panel tomorrow, but in case you're not coming to it, I wanted to add this because I think it's relevant to your question. We basically, our panel is about just doing things guerrilla style and opening doors, and to Rose's point, make the call, ask the questions, and talk to everybody. I can't even tell you how many things have happened for our company just by going out to random people and telling them what we do and not being afraid. I mean, we went to a festival called the First Time Fest in New York, which was for first-time filmmakers, and that was the first time I met Rose, and she was sitting on a camera like this, and she is known as the godmother of first-time filmmakers, and she is a presence, and I was a little nervous, but Kathleen and I walked right up to her, and here we are, we're making movies together, and she's an incredible person.
You just never, you always have your cards on you.
Yeah.
I go up to actors all the time who've become really close friends. I go up to them in Starbucks, or you never, that story about Mariah Carey going to Tommy Mottola, the perfect music story about, having a CD in her pocket or a cassette and dropping it in his coat pocket. Those things do happen, or, meeting with, I always wanted to do a short film called Waiting for Marty, about, waiting for one day running into Marty Scorsese on the street and a young filmmaker, giving him a video. But we have those experiences, and, it's really uncomfortable to approach strangers sometimes, unless you're like me, like I talk to everybody. I talk to Jack the Ripper if I had to, but you just, you start conversations with people, and the minute you say I'm an indie filmmaker, people's attention, I mean, it's not like you're saying I'm a forensic accountant. You're a filmmaker. People are interested in that,
Especially, one more just point to that, on the major label and major publisher level, they do this all day long. So there are parameters for every song that when you call up, and they're going to ask you very specific information. How long is the use? Is it vocal up or instrumental? Where are you distributing it? And you can negotiate, especially as an independent, to Rose's point. Generally, you can get better terms than you would think if you just ask. And you can do things that are for the film festival circuit only, and then if it gets picked up by a major company,
Then
it triggers a higher fee that you pay.
That's a really good
Yep.
point,
I
Scott.
mean, you don't know what the catalogs are spilling off either.
Yeah.
You know, every song in every catalog is spilling off a different amount of money. You know, and the other thing is that you may be intrinsically really helping those people who own those songs. You've got to realize that. You've got to have that confidence that you're giving them something too. Something that in this world, and those crazy things that happen, could give new life to a song that you think may be making millions of dollars a year, but isn't.
Yeah.
You don't know the numbers. You know, so you just got to do the talking.
My son was doing a film called Simon Killer, which is a really low budget movie that was premiered at Sundance and stuff, and he wanted this one piece of music, and the band just kept saying no, they didn't want to do a small indie film and everything, and the film turned out to be amazing, but the soundtrack was incredible, and he just stopped them. He totally stopped them, and he got the music, you know, and for practically nothing, because he showed them the film. He's, you know, like I said, this is where, you know, and showed them the edit. But what Scott said is really important is do something simpler, get it for the festival circuit, you know, which is not going to be a huge amount. If the film gets picked up, then you've got a perfect argument, Sony Classics or Fox Searchlight or whoever, Orchard or whatever, say, oh, you know, now we have to clear the music. And if it's something so iconic that makes the film or whatever, they're going to help you do it, you know, because that's how they're going to get the film out. That's it, you know, that's the best advice you got today was right there.
And one for one. Any other questions or comments? Any other experiences you guys want to share? We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so like, how would you like present, how would you offer, like would you like a storyboard with the licensed song, or like, how would you like present it to the artist?
Generally, you're not presenting to the artist. If it's a major artist, you're talking to their record label and their publisher. Some people may be curious, but my general experience is they don't really care about that. You're not going to be expected to show them the cut, if you will. Some artists might, but 90% of the time, in my experience, it's really about, how are you using it? What's the length of the use? And where is this thing going? Is it going onto network television? That's a much different conversation than an independent project.
They'll want to know the context too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
You know,
Generally, there's a descriptor
yeah.
that will say it's a scene where this happens and these characters do this, and so there's some background, but they won't actually generally expect to see the clip.
And as to the best use of your money, as you get on in your career as a filmmaker or a producer of films or content, the best hire you can make is a good music supervisor. That is really important because they deal with this on a daily basis, and that's their job. I mean, their job is to take care of all of that stuff.
Any other questions, comments? No? All right. Well, I'd like to thank our distinguished guests here for their input. Please give a round of applause for Fred Shahab.